The cowboy came to stop a wedding that could never happen. But the woman stepping off the train asked a question he wasn't prepared to answer. Snow whipped across the station platform as Wyatt pushed through a crowd gathering around the arriving train. The whistle screamed through the mountain air. His gloves felt stiff with cold. A young woman stepped down carrying a worn suitcase, brushed snow from her coat, and searched the faces waiting for her. Then her eyes landed on Wyatt. Before he could find the right words, she asked where her groom was. Wyatt opened his mouth, but another sound cut through the wind, and suddenly nothing about this day felt simple anymore. If you're listening, tell me where you're watching from. 3 days after burying his uncle, Wyatt Mercer sat in a chair that felt too small for him and stared at a sheet of paper spread across Judge Franklin Doyle's desk. Outside, snow drifted past the courthouse windows. The first real storm of the season had settled over Pine Creek Basin during the night. The town's main street was already covered in white. Wyatt barely noticed. His attention stayed on the document. "I don't understand," he said quietly. Judge Doyle removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Neither did I the first time I read it." The old lawyer slid the contract across the desk. Wyatt read the name again. Ruby Bennett, 28 years old. Missouri marriage contract. His uncle's signature sat at the bottom, a date from 14 months earlier. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking wall clock. "My uncle never mentioned any of this." "No," Doyle replied. "He kept it private." Wyatt stood and walked to the window. The glass had frosted around the edges. His uncle had left him a ranch drowning in debt. That alone was enough trouble. Now this. A woman was traveling across half the country, believing she was about to marry a man already buried beneath frozen Montana soil. "When does she arrive?" Doyle opened a telegram. "Tonight." Wyatt closed his eyes. Tonight. Not next week. Not next month. Tonight. By late afternoon, he was riding toward the Pine Creek rail station. The wind pushed hard against him. Snow swept across the road in long white ribbons. His horse lowered its head and kept moving. The station appeared through the storm shortly before sunset. A few ranchers stood beneath the overhang. A freight wagon waited beside the loading platform. Then the whistle came. Long, low, lonely. The train emerged from the storm like a dark iron ghost. Steam rolled into the freezing air. Passengers began stepping down. Families reunited. Travelers collected luggage. Wyatt searched unfamiliar faces. Then he saw her. A woman carrying a worn brown suitcase. Dark wool coat. Simple gloves. A calm expression that didn't quite hide exhaustion. She looked around carefully before her eyes settled on him. Something told him immediately that she was Ruby Bennett. She walked straight toward him. No hesitation, no uncertainty. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked. Her voice was soft but steady. Wyatt swallowed. "No." A small line appeared between her eyebrows. "I'm Wyatt Mercer." The wind howled between the buildings. For a second, nobody spoke. Then she asked the question he had been dreading all day. "Where is your uncle?" The answer seemed heavier than the storm clouds above them. "He passed away 3 days ago." Everything around them continued moving. People unloaded trunks. Workers shouted. Steam hissed from the train. Yet somehow the world felt completely still. Ruby didn't speak. Her fingers tightened slightly around the suitcase handle. Nothing more. No dramatic reaction. No tears. Only silence. Finally, she looked toward the distant mountains, then back at Wyatt. "How did he die?" "Heart trouble." She nodded once. The movement was small, almost invisible. "I'm sorry," Wyatt said. So am I. The train whistle sounded again. The last passengers hurried aboard. Ruby watched it for a moment. Then she looked at Wyatt. What happens now? The question hung between them. He wished he had an answer. Back in town, Doyle gave them the rest. The bank loan, the contract, the legal complications. Every word seemed to make the situation worse. When the lawyer finished, Wyatt leaned back in his chair. So, if the agreement ends, the bank may demand immediate repayment. How much? Doyle named the amount. The room went quiet. Wyatt knew there was no possible way to raise that kind of money quickly. Ruby lowered her eyes to the papers. She read every page herself, slowly, carefully. When she finally set them down, she looked more tired than before. Not defeated, just tired. I need time to think. That's fair, Wyatt said. A few hours later, they rode toward Pine Creek Ranch beneath a sky full of falling snow. The ranch appeared near midnight. Lantern light glowed from the barn. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Old Amos Reed met them on the porch. He looked from Wyatt to Ruby and wisely asked no questions. Inside, Wyatt showed her the spare bedroom. The room was small. A bed, a dresser, a wash basin. Nothing more. Ruby placed her suitcase beside the bed. Thank you. It was the first time her voice sounded truly sincere. Wyatt nodded. If you need anything, Amos or I will be nearby. She studied him for a moment, almost as if she was trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then she quietly closed the door. An hour later, Wyatt sat alone at the kitchen table. A coffee cup cooled beside his hand. Snow tapped softly against the windows. His uncle was gone. A stranger slept down the hallway. And somewhere in the darkness, a bank was waiting to take everything. Then a sharp crack split the night. Amos jumped from his chair. What was that? Another sound followed. Wood splintering outside. Wyatt rushed to the front door. Cold air slammed into him as he stepped onto the porch. Across the yard, hanging above the ranch entrance, the Pine Creek sign swung crookedly in the wind. A fresh bullet hole sat in the center. The darkness beyond the gate was empty. Whoever fired the shot was already gone. Behind him, the front door opened. Ruby stood wrapped in a blanket. Snowflakes landed in her hair. She looked from the damaged sign to Wyatt. Neither of them spoke, but both understood the same thing. The trouble waiting at Pine Creek Ranch had arrived long before she did. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Snow rested along the fence rails like folded blankets. Smoke curled from the cookhouse chimney and drifted across the yard. Wyatt was already outside breaking ice from the water trough when Amos stepped out of the barn carrying a shovel. Neither man mentioned the bullet hole. Not yet. Some things could wait until coffee. Inside the ranch house, Ruby was awake before sunrise. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cradled between both hands. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh biscuits. Several ledgers lay open before her. At first she had only meant to glance through them. Now nearly an hour had passed. The deeper she looked, the worse it became. Bills stuffed between pages, missing entries, unpaid invoices, receipts folded into random sections. One supplier had not been paid in 6 months. Another had sent 3 separate notices. When Wyatt walked in, removing his gloves near the stove, he found her studying a page beneath the lantern light. You've been working already? Ruby looked up. I couldn't sleep. Wyatt poured himself coffee. Find anything useful? She turned the ledger toward him. You owe your blacksmith. I know. You owe your feed supplier. I know. You owe your ranch hands. That one made him pause. Ruby noticed. The silence answered for him. Wyatt sat down heavily. The cattle market dropped last spring. Ruby nodded slowly. Then she opened another ledger. It looks like your uncle borrowed money from nearly everyone willing to lend it. He was trying to keep the ranch alive, and now you're trying to do the same. Wyatt stared into his coffee. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The wind rattled the kitchen window. Finally, Ruby closed the book. Then we'll need better records. The word slipped out naturally. Will. She seemed to notice it at the same moment he did. For a brief second, their eyes met. Then she looked back down. The conversation moved on. Outside, life continued. Cattle needed feeding. Horses needed checking. Winter never paused for personal problems. Over the following days, a rhythm slowly formed. Ruby spent her mornings sorting paperwork in the small office beside the kitchen. Stacks of receipts became organized piles. Past due notices were filed by date. She even rewrote entire pages of accounts that had become nearly unreadable. Meanwhile, Wyatt rode fence lines and checked livestock. Sometimes they barely exchanged more than a few words. Yet something was changing. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough. One afternoon, Ruby carried a bucket toward the barn and made the mistake of stepping behind a nervous horse. The animal jerked sideways. Its rear hoof struck a wooden post. Ruby froze. Before she could react, Wyatt appeared. His hand closed around her arm. He pulled her clear just as the horse kicked again. The bucket tumbled into the snow. Water spilled across the ground. For a moment, neither moved. You all right? Ruby nodded. A strand of hair had escaped beneath her scarf. I am now. Wyatt released her arm immediately. Not awkward, not lingering, just respectful. Ruby noticed that too. A few days later, another storm rolled through Pine Creek Basin. 3 calves disappeared from the south pasture. Wyatt found their tracks heading toward a shallow ravine. Ruby insisted on helping. The search lasted most of the afternoon. Snow creaked beneath their boots. The sky hung low over the mountains. Eventually, they found the calves huddled beside a cluster of pines. Cold, hungry, alive. On the ride home, Ruby watched Wyatt lift one frightened calf into the wagon as carefully as if it weighed nothing. He never said much, but she was beginning to understand the things he didn't say. Back at the ranch, Amos quietly watched the two of them work together. He hid a smile beneath his gray beard. That evening, Ruby returned to the ledgers. Something bothered her. A name kept appearing. Again and again and again. Different loans, different dates, same lender, Pike Agricultural Holdings. She pulled additional documents from a drawer, then more. Soon half the desk was covered in paper. The realization came slowly. Then, all at once, the largest debt, the mortgage, the emergency loans, they all traced back to one man. Gideon Pike. Ruby leaned back in her chair. Outside, snow drifted past the office window. Inside, the lantern flame flickered. She stared at the documents for a long time. The ranch wasn't simply struggling. Someone had positioned himself to take it. The next afternoon, a polished carriage rolled through the front gate. Its dark wheels cut through fresh snow. Wyatt stepped onto the porch before the driver had even stopped. He recognized the visitor immediately. Gideon Pike, tall, well-dressed, too clean for a Montana winter. Beside him stood a young woman wrapped in an expensive fur coat. Evelyn Pike. Ruby watched from inside the house. She stayed near the doorway, unseen, unheard. Outside, Gideon smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Wyatt, he said, you've had a difficult few months. What do you want? Gideon glanced toward the ranch. I came to discuss solutions. Wyatt already disliked where the conversation was headed. The older man folded his gloves carefully. There is still a simple way to save this ranch. Silence settled across the yard. Even the wind seemed to pause. Gideon nodded toward his daughter, Mary Evelyn. Wyatt's expression hardened immediately. The older rancher continued. The debts disappear. No hesitation. No shame. Just business. Inside the house, Ruby stood motionless beside the window. Every word carried through the cold air. Outside, Wyatt stared at Gideon Pike. And for the first time since arriving at Pine Creek Ranch, Ruby felt something colder than the Montana winter. She finally understood exactly who was standing on the other side of their troubles. Gideon Pike left before sunset. His carriage disappeared beneath a sky the color of old steel. Evelyn Pike never said a word. She simply sat beside her father and looked out the window as if the entire conversation had already been decided. Back at the ranch house, supper passed in silence. The stew cooled in bowls nobody touched. Amos focused on his bread. Wyatt stared through the window. Ruby watched the flame inside the oil lamp flicker against the wall. Finally, she set down her spoon. If marrying Evelyn saves the ranch, why not do it? The words landed harder than she expected. Wyatt looked up immediately. His expression changed. Not anger. Not yet. Something sharper. Because I don't intend to sell myself to solve a problem. Ruby gave a small, humorless laugh. Funny thing to hear from a man involved in a marriage contract. The room fell quiet again. Wyatt stood and carried his untouched bowl to the sink. Neither spoke another word that night. 3 mornings later, Ruby made her decision. The snow had stopped. Sunlight rested across the valley for the first time in nearly a week. She packed her suitcase carefully. The same suitcase she had carried from Missouri. The same one sitting beside her bed since the day she arrived. A folded dress. 2 books. A notebook. A family photograph. Not much. Never had been. She closed the case and stared at it. Then she heard voices outside. Wyatt and Amos. The ranch hands had gathered near the barn. A rider from town had arrived carrying official papers. Ruby stepped onto the porch. She saw Wyatt reading the document. His jaw tightened. Even from a distance, she knew the news wasn't good. The bank had moved faster than expected. Foreclosure warnings. Restrictions on livestock sales. Additional penalties. Another squeeze. Another turn of the knife. That afternoon, she walked alone toward the old hay barn. The wind carried the smell of pine and cold earth. Inside, sunlight slipped through cracks in the walls. Dust floated in the air. Ruby sat on an overturned feed crate. For the first time since coming west, she allowed herself to cry. Quietly. No audience, no witnesses, only the empty barn. She wasn't crying because she was afraid. She had been afraid before. She was crying because she had become part of something she never meant to belong to. And now she believed she was destroying it. When she returned to the house, Wyatt found the suitcase. It sat beside the front door. Ready, waiting. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he looked at Ruby. What's this? She folded her hands. You already know, no. His voice remained calm. Dangerously calm. Tell me. I'm leaving. The room seemed to shrink. Amos quietly stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Ruby forced herself to continue. If I'm gone, Gideon loses his leverage. You can do what you need to do. Wyatt stared at her. Then something finally broke. No. The word echoed through the room. Ruby blinked. What? I said no. His voice rose for the first time since she'd known him. You don't get to decide that. I'm trying to help by running away. I'm trying to stop being the reason this ranch is drowning. Wyatt slammed his hand against the table. The coffee cups rattled. You are not the reason. Silence. Heavy. Breathing became the loudest sound in the room. Ruby looked away. Wyatt did not. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he walked outside. A few seconds later, a sharp crack echoed through the yard. Ruby stepped onto the porch. Wyatt stood near the fence line. One of the wooden posts had split clean down the middle beneath his fist. The cold air hung between them. Neither spoke, because there was nothing left to say. 3 days later, Judge Franklin Doyle arrived from town. His coat carried fresh snow across the shoulders. He entered carrying a leather satchel thick with papers. I found something your uncle left behind. They gathered around the kitchen table. The lawyer removed an old envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Inside were military records, letters, photographs. One image showed 2 young soldiers standing beside a supply wagon decades earlier. Judge Doyle placed it on the table. Wyatt leaned closer. Ruby did too. The lawyer pointed toward one of the men. That's your uncle. Then he pointed toward the other. Ruby's breath caught. It was her father. You knew him? She asked quietly. Judge Doyle nodded. Your father saved Silas Mercer's life during an attack near Fort Robinson many years ago. The room grew still. The old lawyer opened another letter. Your uncle never forgot. Ruby read the faded handwriting. Line after line. Promise after promise. Then the truth emerged. The marriage contract had never been about acquiring a bride. It had been protection. A shield. A legal way to pull Ruby beyond the reach of creditors who had been circling her family for years. Her father had died never knowing the plan would one day be needed. Ruby lowered the letter. Her hands trembled. Across the table, Wyatt sat motionless. Everything they thought they knew had changed. Before anyone could speak, another knock sounded at the door. A second messenger. Another envelope. Another blow. Wyatt opened it slowly, read it once, then again. The color drained from his face. 30 days. That was all the bank was giving them. 30 days before Pine Creek Ranch would be auctioned to the highest bidder. Outside, the winter sun disappeared behind dark Montana clouds. Inside, nobody moved. The clock on the wall continued ticking. 30 days. And suddenly, every one of them could hear it. Not just the ticking clock on the kitchen wall. Everything. The wind outside. The creak of old floorboards. The distant rattle of loose tin on the barn roof. 30 days had turned every sound into a reminder. Winter settled harder over Pine Creek Basin after that. The snow deepened. The roads disappeared beneath drifts. Every trip to town became a gamble. Every dollar mattered. Every sack of feed was counted twice. Wyatt worked longer than ever. Before sunrise, he was already in the saddle. After dark, he was still checking fences and water troughs. Amos warned him more than once. You're wearing yourself thin. Wyatt only shrugged. The ranch didn't care how tired a man felt. Ruby noticed anyway. One evening, she found a cold cup of coffee sitting untouched beside the barn door. The steam had long vanished. The coffee had frozen along the rim. She carried it back inside and quietly poured a fresh cup. When Wyatt came in later, exhausted and snow-covered, the warm mug was waiting beside his place at the table. Neither mentioned it. He simply looked at her. She nodded once, and that was enough. Days passed. Then things became worse. A bank representative arrived from Helena carrying additional restrictions. No cattle sales without approval. No new credit. No extensions. The ranch was being squeezed from every direction. Ruby watched Wyatt read the notice beneath the porch lantern. He folded it carefully. Too carefully. As if crushing it would somehow make everything harder. 3 nights later, the storm arrived. the worst of the season. Snow hammered the valley. Wind screamed through the pines. Visibility vanished. By midnight, the ranch house shook beneath the force of it. Then came the pounding at the door. Amos burst inside, carrying Snow across the floor. The north fence! Wyatt was already reaching for his coat. What happened? Somebody cut it. The room went silent. Ruby looked up immediately. Amos didn't need to say the name. Nobody did. A section of fence had been destroyed. The herd had scattered into the storm. Outside, lanterns swung wildly in the darkness. Cowboys saddled horses while snow stung their faces. Wyatt mounted up. Ruby grabbed his sleeve before he could leave. Be careful. The words escaped before she could stop them. For a second, he looked at her. Really looked. Then he nodded. I will. And disappeared into the storm. The night stretched endlessly. Ruby remained at the ranch. Calves were being brought into the barn. Weak animals needed shelter. Blankets. Warm water. Anything. She organized whoever remained. Amos's wife from a neighboring homestead arrived to help. Then another rancher's son. Then another. Word spread quickly through Pine Creek. By dawn, the barn was full of exhausted people working side by side. Nobody gave orders. Ruby simply saw what needed doing and did it. Others followed. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. Just after sunrise, Wyatt returned. His horse looked nearly as tired as he did. Snow covered his coat. Ice clung to his beard. But behind him came cattle. Not all of them. Enough. He dismounted slowly. Ruby stepped from the barn. For a moment, neither spoke. She noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. He noticed the hay scattered across her coat, the sleepless night written across her face. You stayed up. So did you. A faint smile appeared. Small. Gone almost immediately. Still there. Something neither of them missed. The following evening, the storm finally passed. The valley lay quiet beneath fresh snow. A deep silence settled over the ranch, the kind that only comes after hardship. That night, Wyatt and Ruby sat beside the fireplace after everyone else had gone to bed. No ledgers, no bank notices, no plans. Just the crackling of burning wood. For a long time, neither spoke. The flames reflected softly across the room. Finally, Wyatt broke the silence. My mother died during a winter storm. Ruby looked toward him. He kept watching the fire. I was 16. Another pause. I spent years thinking if I'd worked harder, been stronger, maybe things would have turned out different. The confession seemed to surprise even him. Ruby listened quietly. Then she folded her hands together. My father used to say, guilt is the heaviest suitcase a person can carry. Wyatt glanced at her. She smiled sadly. I've carried one for a long time myself. The fire popped softly. Outside, the wind had finally stopped. For the first time since meeting, neither felt like strangers, not completely. The next morning, Ruby returned to the office. She began sorting through older mortgage records, boxes nobody had touched in years, dust-covered files, receipts, property surveys, canceled notes. Hours passed. Then something caught her attention. A date, then another. Her eyes narrowed. She pulled additional documents, compared signatures, compared amounts, compared property descriptions. Slowly, a pattern emerged. One paper didn't match the others. Then a second. Then a third. Ruby's heartbeat quickened. She carried the files into sunlight near the window. Read them again and again. By afternoon, she was riding hard toward the south pasture. Wyatt spotted her long before she reached him. She barely waited for her horse to stop. "I found something." Her voice shook, not with fear, with certainty. Wyatt took the papers. Ruby pointed to the signatures, the property descriptions, the altered dates, the missing records. Gideon Pike forged part of the mortgage transfer. The words hung in the cold air. Wyatt stared at her, then back at the papers. If she was right, everything changed. The foreclosure, the debt, the entire case, all of it. Ruby met his eyes. For the first time in weeks, hope appeared. Small, fragile, but real. "We can prove it," she said. The mountains stood silent around them. The future suddenly balanced on a handful of documents and one final chance. That night they packed supplies, fresh horses, blankets, coffee in a metal flask. The hearing would take place in town at first light. There would be no second opportunity. Before dawn, they rode out together beneath a sky full of stars. The snow crunched beneath their horses' hooves. The courthouse lights waited somewhere beyond the darkness. And for the first time since the trouble began, they weren't riding toward defeat. They were riding toward the truth. The sky above Montana was still black when Wyatt and Ruby crossed the frozen creek east of Pine Creek Basin. Their horses moved carefully over patches of ice. Neither spoke much. The leather creaked softly. Breath drifted from horse and rider alike. Ruby kept one gloved hand pressed against the satchel carrying the documents. The papers felt heavier than they should have. A few sheets of ink and signatures, yet everything seemed to depend on them. By sunrise, they reached town. Smoke rose from chimneys. Wagons lined the muddy main street. People were already gathering outside the county courthouse. Word had spread. In places like Montana Territory, news traveled almost as fast as gossip, and everyone wanted to see whether Pine Creek Ranch would survive. Judge Franklin Doyle stood near the courthouse steps. The old lawyer looked tired, but when he saw Ruby carrying the documents, something changed in his expression. Hope, small, careful. "But there, you found something." Ruby nodded. "I believe we did." Inside, the hearing room filled quickly. Ranchers, merchants, bank representatives, neighbors from Pine Creek. Even Amos had made the journey despite the snow. At the far end of the room sat Gideon Pike, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, Evelyn beside him. For a moment, Gideon's eyes settled on Ruby, then on the satchel. His smile faded, only slightly. Judge Doyle noticed it too. The hearing began. The bank representative spoke first. He described the debt, the overdue payments, the foreclosure process. Everything sounded official, final, as though Pine Creek Ranch had already been buried. Then Doyle stood. "I request additional evidence be entered into the record." The room shifted. Heads turned. Gideon's jaw tightened. Ruby rose slowly. Every eye followed her. She hated attention. Always had. But this wasn't about comfort anymore. This was about truth. She placed the documents on the table, one by one. Mortgage records, transfer forms, land surveys, receipts, ledger copies, dates, signatures, details, small things most people overlooked. Ruby explained them quietly, methodically, never raising her voice, never rushing. She pointed to altered numbers, missing pages, different handwriting hidden among identical records. One inconsistency became 3. 3 became 10. The room grew quieter with each discovery. Even the banker leaned forward. Gideon interrupted twice, then 3 times. The judge silenced him each time. Finally, Doyle presented the last document, an original mortgage copy recovered from county archives. Its dates did not match Gideon's version, neither did the signatures. The forgery was undeniable. Silence filled the room. Heavy silence. The kind that changes lives. Gideon Pike stood abruptly. "This is nonsense!" But the confidence was gone. Everyone could hear it. The judge reviewed the documents again, then slowly removed his spectacles. "The foreclosure proceedings are suspended immediately." A murmur swept through the courtroom. "The evidence strongly suggests fraudulent alterations to the mortgage agreements." Another pause. Then the final words. "Pine Creek Ranch remains under the ownership of Mr. Wyatt Mercer." For a moment, nobody moved. Ruby simply stared ahead. The fight that had consumed months of her life was suddenly over. Amos lowered his head. Relief showed plainly on his weathered face. Outside, church bells rang noon across town. Someone laughed. Someone else cheered. The room began to come alive again. Only Gideon remained frozen. His empire had cracked. Not because of a gun. Not because of force. Because one woman had paid attention to details everyone else ignored. When they stepped outside, townspeople gathered around them. Men who had barely spoken to Ruby before now shook her hand. Women thanked her. A shopkeeper offered coffee. Another promised free supplies for the ranch. Ruby accepted none of it. She only smiled politely. The attention felt strange, almost unreal. Later that evening, they returned to Pine Creek Ranch. The mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. The snow reflected pink and orange light. Everything looked peaceful. For the first time in months, there were no deadlines waiting for them. No threats. No ultimatums. No Gideon Pike. Just silence. And the long road home. 3 days later, Ruby packed her suitcase. The same worn suitcase she had carried from Missouri. She folded each dress carefully, wrapped her father's Bible in cloth, placed everything inside. When she finished, the room looked exactly as it had the day she arrived, as though she had never been there at all. That hurt more than she expected. Outside, Wyatt hitched the wagon without saying much. Neither of them did. The ride to town felt longer than before. The station appeared beyond a curtain of falling snow. A train waited beside the platform. Steam drifted upward into the cold air. Ruby stepped down from the wagon. Her heart felt strangely heavy. Wyatt handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed. Land ownership papers. Savings. Enough money to start over anywhere she wanted. She looked up at him. "What is this? A future?" His voice remained calm. "If you want one somewhere else." Ruby swallowed hard. He continued. "When you got off that train, other people had already made every decision for you." He glanced toward the waiting locomotive. "Not this time." The wind moved between them. "If you want to leave, I'll walk you all the way to the platform." His eyes never left hers. "But nobody decides for you anymore." The conductor called for passengers. People began boarding. Ruby looked at the train, then at the ticket in her hand, then back at Wyatt. Months earlier, she had arrived carrying nothing except debt and uncertainty. Now she had choices. Real choices. The very thing she had wanted all along. The conductor called again. Ruby climbed the first step, then stopped. Everything became quiet. Not around her, inside her. She thought about Missouri, about starting over, about unfamiliar towns, new jobs, new roads. Then she thought about snowy mornings at Pine Creek, coffee cooling beside ledgers, Amos grumbling about weather, the sound of cattle beyond the fence, a stubborn cowboy who had never once treated her like property. The train whistle blew. Ruby stepped back down. The conductor frowned. She handed him the ticket, then turned around. Wyatt had not moved. not an inch. For a second, neither spoke. Then Ruby laughed softly, a little through tears. "Aren't you going to ask why?" His eyes warmed. "No." "Why not?" "Because this time it's your choice." The distance between them disappeared. Not quickly, not dramatically, just naturally, like something finally reaching the place it belonged. Ruby stopped in front of him. "I came west because I had nowhere else to go." Her voice trembled. "But I'm staying because I want to." For a moment, Wyatt closed his eyes, as if he needed a second to believe what he'd heard. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation left. He took her hand. Not to keep her, not to stop her, only because she had chosen to stay. Together they walked back toward the wagon, toward Pine Creek, toward whatever came next. 1 year later, spring sunlight stretched across the valley. Grass covered hills that had once been buried beneath snow. The ranch was alive again. Healthy cattle moved across open pasture. Fresh paint covered the barn. New fencing followed the property lines. Ruby sat at a desk near the front window, balancing accounts while sunlight warmed the room. Outside, Wyatt worked a young gelding near the corral. Neither looked exactly the same anymore. Life had a way of leaving its mark, but both looked stronger, happier. Amos sat on the porch in a rocking chair, watching the afternoon drift by, watching neighbors ride in and out, watching a future he once feared would never come. Ruby glanced through the window. Wyatt looked up at the same moment. Their eyes met. A familiar smile passed between them. Simple, quiet, certain. The mountains stood beyond Pine Creek Basin, exactly as they always had. Storms still came. Winters remained difficult. Life remained life. But some things had changed forever. A woman who arrived carrying a single suitcase had saved a ranch. A cowboy who inherited a stranger had found a partner. And neither of them had been rescued by fate. They had chosen each other, again and again. Until choice became love, and love became home. When I think about Wyatt and Ruby, I don't remember the debt papers, the courtroom, or even the long Montana winters. I remember two people standing at a train station with every reason to walk away from each other, and one simple reason to stay. Maybe that's why this story lingers. Because if you place yourself in Wyatt's boots, you can feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on your shoulders. And if you stand where Ruby stood, with a suitcase in your hand and an uncertain future waiting in either direction, you understand how frightening freedom can be when it finally arrives. Life rarely gives us perfect beginnings. Sometimes the people who change our lives arrive wrapped in inconvenience, hardship, or circumstances we never would have chosen. Sometimes healing begins not with a grand miracle, but with a small act of kindness, a promise kept, or a hand that remains extended when it would be easier to let go. That's what stayed with me after this story ended. Not the ranch, not the victory, but the quiet courage of two people who kept choosing trust when fear would have been easier. If this story meant something to you, tell me where in the world you're listening from. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, resilience, love, and the unexpected roads that lead people home, I hope you'll join us again. There are still any journeys waiting beyond the next horizon, and I'd be honored to share them with you. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people who matter most.